Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
On today's episode, we present an interview with an organizer on the recent Stateless conference that took place in Evansville, Indiana. An interview with someone involved in Antifa International, which supports international anti-fascist prisoners, and a discussion on the recent deployment of National Guard troops in Los Angeles, California. A reminder to follow The Beautiful Idea on Mastodon, Blue Sky, and Instagram, and check out our website. The Beautiful Idea is a proud member of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network.
So much has happened since we started to put this episode together. We've got a lot to cover, so let's not waste any time and dive right into it. Fire beats ice. First up, a dam has broken, and the first real eruption in the streets has kicked off against the Trump administration in the fight against ICE and mass deportations. This pushback has been building in recent months, as grassroots organizers and groups on the ground have been hard at work pushing back against growing attacks from ICE and the DHS. We're going to start off our show with a short interview from a reporter at Riot who talks about how ICE is coordinating with local police to create a vast army of law enforcement mobilized to attack migrant workers. Check out the full report on Riot.
Hey, it's great to be with you. So my name's Dan Fight. I've been a reporter with Riot since we started 10 years ago. We're a nonprofit media group, and we do try to cover what happens at protests and social movements, direct action, stuff like that. And I think part of that over the years has been about trying to understand how the police work. How does high-level policing unfold? And so what kind of led me into this story was trying to understand, what's going on with ICE. Obviously, the government's trying to ramp up with this ICE program. And so I felt after studying these things over years that I was in a good position to try to put some more analysis on this, because I felt that there wasn't enough sort of overview information about how ICE was building these giant task forces. And so I'm happy to bring this to folks. I think it can be empowering to kind of understand better when the government's trying to do something big like this. And I want to try to give people good information about weird subjects like this that are hard to understand.
Yeah, and this comes at a great time to talk about this stuff. I mean, we're seeing ramping up ICE operations all across the country. Talk a little bit about your new reporting, and my understanding is it focuses on the 287G thing, which is basically, as you were saying, like a way in which the state can basically deputize and work with police agencies, which isn't new. I mean, we've seen this under Democratic presidents as well, but Trump just seems to be going full bore with this.
Yes, exactly. And, I went and sort of talked about what I'd been researching to some activists here in Philadelphia, and I just sort of asked people, I was like, who's heard of 287G? And, only a couple hands went up. It's a pretty obscure subject, but 287G has been around for quite a while, and it sort of fell into disrepute back around 2011 when Joe Arpaio, who was the sheriff in Maricopa County, Arizona, was doing sweeps, doing racial profiling, doing very sort of pre-Trump style, very spectacular, detainment of immigrants and that kind of thing. And the DOJ had said, this is not acceptable, how this has been going on, and at that point, 287G kind of fell into the background and wasn't such a large factor for quite a while, but it was never taken off the books, right? Because both political parties have been very reticent to reel in the powers of Homeland Security and ICE after 9/11, when those agencies were bundled from pre-existing agencies. And so it does create a deputization system, and they've been adding dozens and dozens and dozens of agencies, so that's state agencies like the National Guard in Florida, but also college police departments, right? Which is weird. And college police don't really have the level of accountability that a local police department would have. So I thought that was pretty striking. And so Florida has been the place that's added the most local agencies to this system. So what I found was that there's 3 different models. There's a warrant service officer model, which is like, I think it's kind of sending out like individual for warrants type of activity. There's jail enforcement, which I think was maybe a little more well known. That was like filtering people when they get arrested and then detaining them if they're already arrested, then detaining them for ICE. And then there's these task force models. And so the task force model means when the police are out and about, it's not just at the jail. And a great example of that was what was done in Tennessee recently and around Nashville, and they were using the highway patrol in Tennessee in conjunction with a limited number of ICE agents to sweep, and they arrested probably around 200 people in a sweep earlier in May. And so that type of scaling up is basically why the feds need this, what's called a memorandum of agreement. And so when we study how these agencies get connected, the agencies have limited personnel, and I think that's important for people to understand. They don't have an infinite number of people they can throw at everything, right? And so they use these memos like 287G to kind of like attach the agencies to each other. But at the same time, like we also found that like in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, the sheriff there has signed on to 287G, but the county board, the commissioners, they don't want them to do that. They voted against it, but he's doing it anyway. And ICE is like, okay, fine, you're a part of our program now. But again, it's like ICE doesn't have enough personnel to just be doing this all by themselves. And besides 287G as well, what we find is that they're pulling agents out of the regular FBI work. They're pulling them out of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. We've been hearing about other agencies as well besides 287G, but 287G is still, I think, the channel in which they can organize the most personnel to be doing this. I think the bigger picture is also that, since 2020, since the George Floyd uprising, people haven't wanted to be police officers. A lot of counties are very strapped for cash. And I think a lot of local governments are kind of hoping that if they get involved in detaining people for immigration detainers, that they can kind of keep their county jails afloat, keep their, payroll afloat, right? They're hoping that, I think, if they participate in 287G and other detainer programs that we talk about in the article, that will help kind of protect their counties. And so I just kind of I think it can be helpful for people to just kind of understand these multiple levels and how it doesn't all just sort of happen purely within the federal government. It also happens within local governments. And also that I think that local politicians, local civic groups, civil liberties groups may not even be aware of these systems and what's happening. Over the years, what I've found is that when I stumble into a huge system like this, there isn't that much information out there about it. So I just kind of want to improve the quality of the information that's available so that people can kind of orient themselves and, to take action as they see appropriate with a better understanding of the whole environment. And so 287G, I think, is probably the largest channel that's involved in this type of thing in sort of scaling up and finding more personnel, but it's not the only one. And there's a lot of kind of follow the money kind of qualities to all of this.
I think it kind of begs the question, why are they adopting this strategy? It seems like this is just going to piss people off and anger folks. Is that the goal? Or are they just so desperate to hit these numbers that they're just kind of going after people in the back of a restaurant,
I think that one thing that's important to know is Stephen Miller and Tom Homan are the 2 top Trump advisors that are architects of this. Miller has been very adamant, even yelling at the ICE leadership, we need 3,000 arrests a day, 3,000 detainment. Or the day after they removed the leadership of the 2 divisions of ICE, which is called HSI and ERO. They removed those leaderships because they aren't doing enough of what they're wanting. I think that a large part of this goal is really just to try to keep America, as white as possible and just remove people that are in no way whatsoever a public health threat. People that have no criminal records. They've tried to remove people for speeding tickets that were dismissed, for example, in the student channel. This is outside kind of what's been going on with students, which is another huge arena. I think another term that's just been talked about in the last few days is the State Department wants to create what they euphemistically call like an Office of Remigration, which is actually a term that comes out of the white supremacists in Europe and Martin Sellner and the generation identity, kind of like the related to the identity Europa idea of previous years. And that euphemism remigration means trying to like expel as many people as they can that aren't white, arguing that they'll culturally never be able to assimilate. There's a piece on the State Department put on Substack that talks about how these people can't assimilate to, Western tradition, which is another euphemism from the Sellner type of movement, basically. So I think that's really, when you boil it down, that's what the goal is. But I do think that they try to dazzle people, right? They're trying to intimidate, not just activists and community members, but also like the Democratic Party officials, anybody that's not aligned with the MAGA agenda. So we see that with the judge that's been charged in Milwaukee, for example, who seemingly just like had a person at court exit through one hallway door instead of another, and they try to charge that judge. Again, that's to try to send a message. I think a term that is sometimes used is dazzle, which is like a kind of like bombastic intimidation to disorient people and try to rush through things. And, and we've seen that the opposition to the White House has been kind of slow in moving this year. And so some of that does come from, I think, from disorientation and not understanding the systems very well. And so I feel like if we map out the systems, we can get a better handle on it. We also saw it was reported. So my story kind of looks at like a number of different localities, like what's been going on in Texas, what's been going on in Florida, Maryland. There were immigration rights advocates that wanted to try to stop 287G in Maryland, but they weren't able to get anywhere on this legislative session. But that kind of showed that like there is like opposition building and official channels to these kind of deals. And there are several states that do not allow 287G. We also saw a few days ago that the White House declared there were what it thought of as sanctuary cities or counties, and they're going to try to like cut their funding for unrelated programs for this. We've seen that a lot where the White House will, make up some excuse and then say, oh, no, now you don't get any funding for unrelated stuff. And we're going to try to use that as a stick to centralize control. So, it's about centralizing control. It's about also pretending that a lot of undocumented immigrants are a security threat when they're demonstrably not. They will commonly claim in the news that people are a security threat, but then they don't come up with any evidence in court. And that led to the CCOT detentions as well. So, there's a lot of disinformation that's used to kind of create or do like threat construction, right? But also too, at the same time, like they're pulling in all these law enforcement that have other things they're supposed to be doing, but now they're all being put on civil immigration enforcement. So like, it seems like right now the FBI is actually covering up that it's not opening other investigations because they've assigned their staff to work on civil immigration enforcement, and they're basically now covering up what they're doing. So it's getting messy, and it is about intimidation and trying to condition people to a more authoritarian experience in the United States. But I think at the same time, like you saw in San Diego, I think regular people don't find this very tolerable because they know it's already become very obvious that it's about not just intimidating or trying to grab like people that might be dangerous. It's also about trying to grab people that obviously are not a public safety risk at all. And so there's a lot of this going on, and they're trying to ramp it up. And again, I think 287G is such a center of gravity. It's such a key heart of the machinery, because otherwise they can't scale it up very well at all, because they still don't have enough other federal police they can throw at this. So there's a lot of information in the story. I also wanted to outline how the database system work and Palantir and all of that, as well as how these other federal task forces work that could be put into action. And there's great levels of detail about it, but I do believe that if we provide solid information, everyone can be empowered. It can be a less intimidating subject to take on and grapple with. So I really hope everyone checks out the story. It's on our website, unicornriot.ninja. We're nonprofit media, and we really appreciate everyone's support over the last 10 years. So thank you very much for having me today.
In late May, resistance began to heat up at courthouses around the U.S. as people moved to block ICE agents from snatching people at court hearings regarding their immigration status, as the Trump administration pushed for accelerated deportation numbers. These confrontations then escalated into street clashes in San Diego, Minneapolis, and several other cities, before popping off in early June in Los Angeles, California. On June 6th and 7th, thousands mobilized following militarized ICE raids on several workplaces surrounding a federal building in downtown Los Angeles, and demanding that ICE release hundreds of people captured by DHS. The next day, people bravely faced off with ICE after federal authorities raided a Home Depot and attacked those in the wider community who came out to protest. Fierce clashes broke out between community members and state forces, with people throwing projectiles at ICE vehicles, eventually driving them from the area after several hours. The next day, Trump moved to federalize several hundred National Guard troops already in California to deal with the fires, who were then sent in to guard the detention center, leading to more clashes and rioting as the Democratic mayor put a curfew in place and the LAPD began a campaign of mass terror and brutality against protesters. Solidarity demonstrations and similar revolts began to pop off in more cities as people began to shut down courthouses with mass pickets, mobilize to kick ICE agents out of hotels, and respond to immigration raids with rage and determination. Things popped off in Seattle, Portland, Sacramento, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, New York City, Atlanta, Chicago, and beyond. CrimeThink has recently published some amazing report backs that can be viewed online. There's also been some amazing zines published recently to check out and distribute in your community, including 7 Steps to Stop ICE from CrimeThink, It is Fascism, Start Acting Like It from CrimeThink, Fire and Ice, Lessons from the Battle of Los Angeles from Ill Will, Don't Let LA Stand Alone, A Message to the Gathering Resistance from It's Going Down. Meanwhile, in Newark, New Jersey, where demonstrators have been demanding the horrific Delaney Hall ICE prison be closed, prisoners there launched a rebellion which led to several people escaping, according to a report on Jersey Counterinfo. A few days ago, riots broke out at the federal ICE detention center Delaney Hall in Newark, New Jersey. Detainees faced increasing abuse and starvation from their jailers and fought back, reportedly setting fires and knocking down an internal wall used to contain them. At the same time, Delaney Hall was swarmed by waves of protesters who slowed operations and drew the attention of ICE and other federal pigs away from the events occurring inside. Protesters stood their ground and prevented ICE vans from entering the facility and thinned out the number of pigs, helping to prevent the riot from being quelled. During this juncture, 4 men who were kidnapped and imprisoned at Delaney Hall by ICE were able to make their escape from the heavily fortified facility. As of now, they are still free, liberated from detention. Because of the brave actions of the individuals detained inside Delaney Hall and the protesters outside, 4 people were able to escape and gain freedom. It doesn't matter how fortified the state's prisons or detention centers may be, how many federal pigs there are, what weapons they have to brutalize people, solidarity can and will win. Keep fighting by any means necessary. End of quote. There's also so much happening on the ground that it's impossible to give a full roundup of everything, so be sure to check It's Going Down on Blue Sky for daily updates. We hope to get a new episode out soon with a better picture of the full extent of the growing wave of anti-ICE action, as well as some thoughts on the massive No Kings demonstrations, which took place on June 14th, bringing millions of people into the streets. May Day 2025. This May Day, tens of thousands took to the streets across the U.S., celebrating the radical holiday which honors the Chicago anarchist martyrs and the fight for the 8-hour workday. Labor unions, immigrant rights groups, and community organizations held demonstrations across the U.S., decrying the Trump administration's growing attacks on labor unions, immigrant workers, and beyond. Anarchists and autonomous groups also held demonstrations and gatherings across the U.S. to honor the holiday, with various events, actions, and interventions happening in numerous cities. For a full roundup, check It's Going Down. Notable mentions include anarchist-organized May Day gatherings and festivals in Eugene, Oregon, Boise, Idaho, Seattle, Washington, Nevada City, California, Bloomington, Indiana, New Orleans, Louisiana, and in several cities in North Carolina. An anarchist festival took place over several days. In Reno, Nevada, a mutual aid fair was organized. In Denton, Texas, and Binghamton, New York, anarchist book fairs were organized, while in Richmond, Virginia, anarchists also organized a march, which met up with other May Day demonstrations. Meanwhile, in New York City, people occupied the former Yippie HQ building before being evicted by police. Finally, autonomous groups held anti-ICE marches in Tacoma, Washington, Eugene and Olympia, Oregon, and San Francisco, California. Puget Sound anarchists posted a report back on the anti-ICE march on their website, and the Dissonant Times, a new autonomous publication out of Eugene, Oregon, also has a report up on anti-ICE action on May Day, writing, quote, On May 2nd, there was a call for a black bloc under the slogan Mayday Melt Ice, in response to the federal government's unrestrained escalations against migrants, people connected to last year's Palestine Solidarity Movement, and non-white people in general. A short, small march yielded some light property damage and a fairly heavy response from EPD, resulting in 4 arrests. Despite the modest attendance and intensity of attack, this was an important testing of the waters here in Eugene, where the climate of repression is shifting, with police beginning to take a more hands-on approach. Police tactics are evolving, and so should ours. And at the same time, this action proved that confrontational street action is very much still possible here. Things are bad, but you can definitely still while out and get away with it. The inspiration we derive from others is unbound by time and space, and as an offering of gratitude, we tend to this cosmic fire, stoking its eternal flames. Our shouts and laughs and screams fan the embers of resistance. Together, each exhale creates ignition. Clearly, there is a taste for more heat in Eugene. The limits of endless peaceful marches and rallies were reached a long time ago, and we invite others to take initiative themselves, in person, in the streets, in spirit, and/or in the numerous other avenues which sustain our counterattack. Despite setbacks, we will keep growing, offering each other grace as we pivot and learn from mistakes. Momentum excitedly continues to build within us. We know when to resist and when to release. End quote. In the Bay Area of California, members of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, are celebrating a recent victory, following over a month of pickets and strike activity at Urban Ore, a large retail hub that sells used home-hold items and construction materials. Writing on social media, union members wrote, quote, "After 40 days on the picket line, pressuring the owners of Urban Ore to meet with us, engage with us at the bargaining table, and bargain seriously to address workers' needs, we have reached agreement in terms to end our strike. We are feeling incredibly proud of the effectiveness of our strike, grateful for all of the support we've received from community to make that happen, and we are looking forward to reaching a full collective bargaining agreement. We have made some big wins, which wouldn't have been possible without the pressure we were able to exert through our direct action. Solidarity forever." Cop City trials start. Trials for those targeted by the state for resisting the Cop City counterinsurgency training facility have started, with supporters rallying outside of several recent hearings and dropping banners in solidarity across the U.S. Be sure to check out monthly installments of In Contempt on It's Going Down and updates at Delaney the Free and Fire Ant Movement Defense. Anti-Fascist Action and Pride Defense. As Pride Month kicks off in the face of ongoing threats from the far right, gender fascist and Christian nationalist groups are attempting to move in the terrain opened up by Trump, as communities are mobilizing in response. Recently in Davis, California, a black bloc absolutely wrecked a Turning Point USA tabling event with no arrests. In Portland, Oregon, Grassroots journalist Alyssa Azar covered a recent mobilization against Turning Point USA, featuring anti-trans speaker Riley Gaines. This is from We Will Free Us. Quote, "When news spread that TPUSA would be bringing Gaines to PSU, students quickly mobilized. One flyer called for people to, quote, stand up to transphobia on PSU's campus, and outlined plans to meet in the park blocks at 6:15 p.m. and walk to the 3rd floor of Smith by 6:30, when Gaines' event was set to begin. Another flyer promoted a, quote, trans/queer pride block party at 6 p.m. with games like Frisbee and badminton, emphasizing, quote, sports are for everyone. The crowd continued to grow, eventually reaching a few hundred. Most people stayed in the park blocks, but a smaller group gathered at the front of the Smith building, waving flags, holding signs, and confronting people waiting in line to see Gaines. About 30 minutes later, some protesters in the back managed to hold open the doors of the building. A few people rushed inside before cops could intervene. According to a witness, it turned into a quick game of cat and mouse. Protesters got out without being arrested, but shortly after, PPB repositioned their officers directly at Smith's front entrance. The first arrest followed minutes later just outside the building. What happened at PSU on May 5th wasn't just about one speaker or one protest. It was a clear example of how far-right groups like TPUSA are being platformed and given institutional space to grow. It was another example of liberal and institutional complicity. Another example of transphobia being normalized under the guise of, quote, debate. Another example of police escalating against queer and anti-fascist resistance. It is yet again another example of media outlets sanitizing repression while demonizing resistance. But people showed up anyway. They danced, they took risks, and they made it clear. Queer and trans communities in Portland aren't interested in playing nice with fascism. End quote. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Washington, over 500 people mobilized against a far-right Christian nationalist rally featuring Matt Shea, a former Republican politician who called for using violence to establish a Christian theocracy. For several hours, people bravely faced off with Seattle police, who made several violent arrests. In Montreal, Clash MTL reported, quote, "Anti-abortion activists' day thoroughly ruined today. Their charter bus was blocked before it could leave Montreal and delayed for close to an hour. Then, in Quebec City, counter-demonstrators encircled them and drowned them out with boat horns before continuing to block and surround them repeatedly when they tried to march. Riot cops were outflanked and pushed back, and a message was left on some activists' Cybertruck." End quote. For a longer report back in French, check out Montreal Counter Info. On July 14th, neo-Nazi groups and crews of Proud Boys attempted to harass and disrupt No Kings demonstrations across the U.S., but were largely unsuccessful in having any meaningful impact other than getting laughed at and dragged online. In Springfield, Missouri, a group of Patriot Front white supremacists were also driven from a local pride celebration after they attempted to harass locals. Free Palestine. As the genocide, forced starvation, and the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Gaza continues, a new wave of student-led occupations, protests, and hunger strikes have kicked off in the U.S. At UCLA, students marked the 1 year since student occupiers bravely fought off far-right Zionists attempting to tear apart their protest encampment with a film showing of the documentary The Encampments, and were attacked by riot police. Also in California, students at Stanford and across the California State University system launched a hunger strike in solidarity with Palestinians. In Philadelphia, students at Swarthmore College set up a protest encampment to continue to demand divestment from Israel and for the university to fight attacks on international students targeted by Trump. In Baltimore, there was a violent police crackdown on a student encampment in solidarity with Palestine, leading to 2 students at Johns Hopkins University being injured. At Columbia University in New York, students occupied a library on campus, leading to clashes with police and arrests of 80 people. And at Brooklyn College, the NYPD moved to attack student demonstrators who also set up an encampment, arresting several students. Finally, at the University of Washington, UW, students launched an occupation and defended it with barricades, demanding that the university divest from weapons maker Boeing. As a report on CrimeThink wrote, quote, "The University of Washington has been collaborating with Boeing for over a century. The University of Washington plans to use this building to deepen their relationship with Boeing, establishing a closer partnership to further the development of war technologies. Both the university and Boeing aim to benefit from this by sharing access to research facilities, establishing an AI educational institute for developing military technology, and securing Boeing's influence of the engineering curriculum, which functions as a pipeline channeling UW engineering students into Boeing internships and contracts. These contracts promise financial compensation, yet often result in labor abuses and unsafe products. As students and community members of the University of Washington, we condemn this relationship and the intended use of the building. This is why we sought to reclaim the building and repurpose it as a much-needed community space." A report on Puget Sound anarchists wrote, quote, "At approximately 5 p.m., students and their accomplices descended on the newly constructed Interdisciplinary Engineering Building, or IEB. This building was funded by Boeing with the agreement that UW would create a pipeline of students to assist with Boeing's warmongering endeavors. Barricades were constructed outside the building as doors were sealed from the inside. Preparations were also made for the event that the occupation of Shaban al-Dalu Hall, the engineering building, became a long-term project. More and more supporters began to arrive as the day went on, and public call to join the action was released. A feeling of unity spread throughout the crowd as a diversity of tactics was upheld and respected. Barricade builders were offered support and supplies, and community members cooked meals. A rebellious joy filled our hearts as speeches and chants filled the air. Posters praising the Palestinian resistance were plastered on every wall and window available. Almost immediately, the area was swarming with cameras as reporters and fascist grifters heard about the action. These were quickly blocked with umbrellas to protect the identities of the crowd. As the sun began to set, the energy of the crowd shifted as it became clear that the police would attempt to remove the students in the coming hours. Many tactics for defending the building were considered, with the bulk of the students electing to move into the street to block the police advance. Large barricades were built in every adjacent street to stop or delay the police regardless of their approach. As the multi-agency police force began to materialize, an officer from each agency approached the crowd in a failed attempt to facilitate our surrender. This exchange was captured in a now viral video of black-clad and shield-wielding militants forcing them down the hill and back to their lines while chanting, "Move back," mocking a common police dispersal tactics. From this point on, every hostile actor was forced out of the area, including private security and individual agitators, including one man who repeatedly threatened to murder the students. However, the occupation received much support from passersby and motorists. At around 10 p.m., a completely unintelligible dispersal order was given over a malfunctioning LRAD. In response, a massive fire was started at one of the barricades. This fire forced the police to entirely reroute their advance, delaying them severely. This delay gave more than enough time for many within the group to disperse, as staying at the barricades would only result in arrest and injury. The fire was slow to extinguish and effectively crippled the police advance. Over the next 1 to 2 hours, a highly militarized group of SPD, WSP, and UWPD broke into the building and cut students from their lockdowns, causing even further damage as doors were broken down and windows had to be broken to access the students. At the time of writing, 32 students were violently arrested inside the building, causing concussions, damage to limbs and joints, with at least one arrest of the group outside. Shaban al-Dalu Hall and the surrounding area was occupied for a total of almost 7 hours, and police response time was incredibly sluggish, allowing for a significant amount of direct action to take place, resulting in at least $1 million in damage, according to the university. A frankly embarrassed show of force by SPD, WSP, and UWPD. End quote. Again from the report on CrimeThink. Quote, predictably, the corporate media slandered the protesters, decrying them as violent, though 3 protesters were hospitalized as a consequence of police violence during the arrests, and many more were severely bruised, whereas the protesters did not injure anyone. It appears that out of the over $1 million in damages that the university claims to have assessed, much of it was inflicted by police officers as they removed protesters. Dispelling any illusions of a progressive university, the University of Washington leadership spread a similar message, condemning the burning of the dumpsters as violent. Those who control our institutions clearly care more about the burning of trash than the burning of the bodies of their own Palestinian students. Yes, we are in a moment of extreme repression. The consequences of action can be significant. Nonetheless, we believe that the consequences of inaction will be greater. Liberal petitions to political leaders will not save us, nor will an apolitical retreat from struggle. That will leave us weaker for next time, and leave most of us increasingly less safe right now. Revolt and uprising were possible and effective during the first Trump regime. They are tools worth applying today. Resist however you can and must. Mutual aid is a form of resistance. It can entail defense, protecting our communities from ICE, or alleviating the consequences of the financial crisis wrought by the fascist and neoliberal coalition. Direct action is a form of resistance. It can undermine the violent apparatus of the state. Occupation, understood as a decolonial practice, is resistance. Palestine demands resistance, and so does your community. You can read the full report on crimethink.com. And now for upcoming events. On June 21st, there's a Don't Despair, Organize presentation from the Black Rose Anarchist Federation in Sacramento, California. You can find more info at blackrosefed.org. On September 6th, there's the Halifax Anarchist Book Fair in Halifax, Nova Scotia. More info at northshore.info. On September 27th and 28th, another Carolina Anarchist Book Fair will take place in Asheville, North Carolina. More info is available at acabookfair.noblogs.org. On October 11th, the Sacramento Anarchist Book Fair will take place in Sacramento, California. You can find more information on that at the Instagram handle Sacramento Anarchist Book Fair. On October 18th, the Bay Area Anarchist Book Fair will take place in Oakland, California. The Instagram page for that is the Bay Area Anarchist Book Fair. And on October 18th and 19th, the Seattle Anarchist Book Fair will take place in Seattle, Washington. More info on that is available at Seattle Anarchist Book Fair on Instagram. That's going to do it for us. Enjoy the interviews and we'll see you soon. Be sure to follow us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, and Instagram. Thanks, as always, for listening.
I'm Webster, and I'm calling from The Warren, which is a social space that just opened in Evansville, Indiana, part of a worker co-op, Autonomous Spaces Cooperative. And the space is in partnership with the Prison Abolition Group Focus Initiative, which is headed out of Indianapolis, Indiana.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Tell us a little bit about what you just mentioned. Break all that down for us, the Warren and how it's connected to other autonomous spaces and projects.
Locally, a effort to acquire a social space, just like a place that people within the anarchist scene here and then also more broadly coming from different traditions and backgrounds can come together and kind of experiment with what it's like to socialize and work on projects together. We started an effort to find and produce a space like that about 6 years ago, and it's gone through a lot of different changes and different configurations. And I think part of that experience was really one of the impetus for putting on the conference, thinking in terms of just what it looks like for people to be willing to experiment and be willing to interact with political configurations that are constantly changing and never quite what you ideally want them to be. So we formed a worker cooperative, and that leases perpetually a portion of the building from the nonprofit Focus Initiative that does a lot of prisoner support and reentry work, political education, family support through Indianapolis primarily.
Gotcha. And tell us a little bit about the conference. What was it and what happened?
The conference was Statelessness, and that came about in part because of the relationships that some of us have through different projects with the local Haitian community, but then also in reading a book by Jane Gordon, which is Statelessness and Contemporary Slavery. In Jane's book, she suggests that statelessness as a condition is multifaceted and is also not uncommon. And thinking through how common some of the interactions we have with stateless people are, it made us want to pursue, a weekend long of conversations about those different forms and the way that those different situations can inform, for anarchists especially, ways that we kind of miss conceptualizing the difficulties and the, like something like not pure forms that these very long traditions can help us identify and relate to.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, you said building relations with the local Haitian community. There's obviously been so much discussion around demonizing Haitian people, both before and after the election. I think there's an open question now if Trump will go after Haitian people more so, or revoke like TPS status or whatever. Talk a little bit about that. What's that been like, building those relationships as this, racist madness is playing out?
Yeah, one thing that I think is important, at least with my experience with working with the Haitians in Evansville, is that it came about through pursuing the projects we were already doing. So some of us in town for over a decade have worked on collective housing. And it was through just doing that the way we already were that we ran into Haitians who were also working on each other's houses and trying to produce a mutual aid form of housing. So we just linked up with them and broadened the way we were doing our project to incorporate facilitating more of their collectively owned houses. And so, over that time, one of the things I've really appreciated is just that in their own cultural traditions, they have ways of doing a lot of the same ethical pursuits that we do. So, for example, in one of the houses that we helped residents buy, they got behind on their payments, and the way that they were able to catch up is they have a traditional collective fund they call a SOL, S-O-L. And so they let us know if we were able to give them more time, their turn at the collective pot was going to come around and they'd be able to catch up that way. And that's not anything we need to help them facilitate or structure. It's just something that they've done for a long time in their culture. And there's a lot of examples like that that are very inspiring coming from their own traditions.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned just collective cooperative housing. Talk a little more about that. Like, what led you to pursue that? Obviously, besides, America being, in a housing crisis. It's interesting. I was just listening to NPR and they were talking about how churches, in an effort to retain people, this is just one example, but, this one church was building essentially low-income housing on their property. Talk a little more about that.
There are examples of churches doing that in Evansville, and actually kind of extensively. Memorial Baptist Church has a project like that on the south side of town, which is where people fleeing slavery historically have congregated, and the large black population there on that side of town. Yeah, I think that primarily it's just figuring out how to stabilize cheaper housing. A lot of the projects that at least I'm able to participate in, I'm able to participate in because I haven't had to tie myself to a mortgage or rent for probably at least 10 years, which frees up a lot of funds and a lot of time.
I hate you. Just kidding. Just kidding.
No,
that's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
I understand. But I think that one of the things that comes with that in our situation is we've been able to pursue that because of an old housing stock. I found a paper from Indiana University written in 1914 that was advocating demolishing our neighborhood because it said it was like too old and poor and run down. But a lot of that same housing is still there. And so part of the way we've done housing is that you also have to fix up your house. You know, it's almost like a DIY habitat style. So like with the Haitians, for example, you know, they bought a house and then for a year or two, you know, we were going there together and just putting it into a shape and learning how to do things together to be able to make it livable. And then, you know, after 2 years, they never had to pay for it again. So they also were able to free up time and pursue opening it to other people in their community. It's not uncommon for them to house, you know, 2 or 3 families at a time.
Let's kind of turn back to the conference again. You had Lorenzo, Irvin come out, longtime anarchist, author, organizer. Talk a little bit about the content that was there and the speakers. It looked like a pretty amazing lineup.
Yeah, I think that a lot of overlap and intersection happened. And Lorenzo, I think, is really key for framing things. And I was excited for him to be the first speaker because I think that, you know, not to idealize statelessness, you know, it comes with a lot of conflict and tribulation. And I think that Jane Gordon does a real good job of making sure that that's understood in her book. And Lorenzo's story, you know, being in a situation where he was charged with attempted murder on a white supremacist, organizing with the Black Panthers, and then needing to flee the country through hijacking an airplane and then trying to find refuge in different socialist experiments around the world, that all of these things really just lended themselves to different things that, you know, the struggle and violence that people have to deal with, the racism, the confronting the realities of these different, you know, socialist experiments around the world. All of this really allowed for a wide introduction to themes of the conference.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, you know, I mean, obviously we're in this new moment. People are experimenting, thinking about what's happening. It feels like we're trying to wrap our heads around the new administration, but also just the continuation of the reality of capitalism now. I mean, you know, just the fact that we're talking about sort of just, it seems like a key aspect of this time is that things have gotten worse just materially themselves than they have, you know, even like 4 years ago, you know, when the George Floyd rebellion kicked off. So I'm curious, you know, coming out of the conference, did you have any extrapolations or big thoughts about sort of like where we're at and what that means?
I don't know about big thoughts. I think that it was a real opportunity with some of the people from these different cultures being together, and then also folks, you know, like white American anarchists who have participated in these different like cultural struggles, being able to see that things being materially worse is in large part a kind of material condition that is like normalized already around a lot of the world and in cultures, but it is being something that like the American culture has to contend with in a way that it hasn't before. So there were Kurdish people here, too, people, you know, the documentary that Matt Peterson brought about the Palestinian situation and how it is mirrored a lot and shares a lot of things in common with the indigenous population in the United States. That some of these, you know, struggles that people have dealt with for centuries. And so being able to not feel like we have to take on, you know, we being certain parts of the American population that haven't had to contend with that there are ways and peoples that we can look to and interact with to learn not only how to deal with that struggle ourselves, but how to be in struggle with them. And that may be one of the reasons that some of the way we're experiencing the deprivation now is because we haven't taken seriously being in like common struggle with these different people.
If you have any more thoughts on sort of like the moment right now in terms of just like what's developed so far under Trump and is it more of a question of just thinking, kind of pulling back and actually thinking more about what we've been doing in general, not just sort of like the latest kind of flashy stuff, I guess, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I have been thinking about that. And in terms of the statelessness, the things that have come up in the conference and the studies leading up to it. Yeah, Lorenzo being, I think, in his almost like mid-80s now, and just like an opportunity to interact with different comrades through different projects who are around that age bracket. When I got into anti-authoritarian organizing, it was very uncommon to run into more than like one person over 30. And so I think that, seeing a lot of older people publicly active, that there's something that we've missed. I'm in my mid-40s now, something that we've missed over these years about how to interact with these different age groups comes from some sort of lack of intergenerational spaces, like physical spaces and then also spaces of struggle. But it's never too late for us to, take that on and take it on in a humble way where we don't know what all that entails. And so that was actually one of the conversations that came out of the conference, was how to make more space within our struggles, but then also take on a explicit project about how to integrate the needs of our elderly comrades. I think that can only help us relate to people outside of the political identities that we share and understand what their concerns are and how to actually materially help them with those.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting tension, because I feel like for so long people have had a discussion of like, we need a multi-generational movement, and then all of a sudden when you have people that are multi-generational in one setting, you're like, well, actually, what does it look like to age in movement, and to have spaces that, have elders, that have young people, that having families, kids, and I think, that's an interesting discussion to have. But I think once you do that, you open up the space for so many more people to get involved.
Yeah, one of the presentations on Trans Panic, I'd say that the way that was largely framed was kind of around understanding how the right has turned towards criminalizing and villainizing queer experiences by looking through a timeline of how the capitalist economy tried to adjust itself through different crises it was having by trying to turn back towards the normative hetero family. And so, thinking through that framework and then seeing something like, one of the presenters bringing their kid, and then the Haitian community bringing, their group of children all hanging out together. There's these things, these different relationships that exceed the bounds of political identity and allow us to interact with each other in ways that confuse and complicate, who we are together. And I appreciate that, and just for a weekend conference, that's a low stakes way to have those interactions and to be able to walk away with like things to contemplate about those experiences together.
Yeah, totally. I mean, just to, pull this thread a little more, I know that like in certain churches, or even in things like the intentional communities movement, back to the land and stuff like that, it's a real problem, people aging out and just not being able to be involved anymore, or, they pass away. And this sort of drain on kind of like social currents and stuff like that. So the ability to actually retain people and to have movement elders involved, and for them to pass down lessons and stories and everything else is really important. I think a lot of us, that are a similar age have also experienced that, coming into autonomous politics and like having previous generations that inspired us not being there has been difficult. So I think the ability for people that have gone through different cycles of struggle to still be around and to even just pass on, like, here's what it was like, here's what we, went through. Not to say that the, previous generations have all the answers, but at least they have, something to share, it is important.
Yeah. I think that they, my experience, at least, some things that you experience is kind of a traumatic shock when you don't have people who have already experienced that to be able to prepare you for it by saying, yeah, this is going to happen. This is going to happen and I survived it and I'm still here with you, still in the struggle. That like really reorients a lot of the risks that people have to take on.
For sure. Well, going forward, places like Evansville, people have been doing projects there for a long time. I mean, obviously we've been talking about stuff that has this long timeline on it. Where do you see this going forward in the next period? What are you excited about?
I'm excited about understanding Evansville in terms of a place that is shaped by people moving through it and coming from other places. Not a place like any place, that doesn't just have a singular tradition, a singular like progressive history, but one that is like messy and complicated. And I'm excited about welcoming, understanding those complications through the different immigrants who are helping shape the space, helping shape the struggles here, and inviting us then to figure out how to participate in things back in Haiti, in Kurdistan. The Palestinian presence here has been really inspiring. Some of the largest like street mobilizations and consistent organizing around issues has come from the Palestinian community. I'm inspired by that and honored to be able to participate in whatever way I can.
My name is Walter, he, him pronouns, and I am part of the Antifa International Social Media Collective.
Awesome. You mentioned this project has been around for a long time. How did it get started and what is its goal?
I'm not really sure how it got started, but in 2014, I was interacting with some other anti-fascists over social media in different countries, and we thought it would be a really good idea to try and coordinate efforts to spread news about anti-fascist actions and movements in our different parts of the world, and then also sort of promote the tenets of anti-fascism through that, and finally do what we can over social media to support anti-fascist crews. So we sort of coordinated our efforts and formed this collective in 2014, starting on Tumblr. I think now we're up to 8 or 9 different social media platforms, and our memberships, we've got a handful of members, but we're in 8 different countries around the world. So it's been really good in terms of like depth and scope of what we can cover.
Awesome. And I think most people probably are aware of you or have seen the work that y'all have done, which has been amazing over the years, largely in connection to supporting prisoners.
Well, so that's actually 2 different projects. So the first thing we did about a year after we got up and running is we noticed increasingly that anti-fascist crews in different parts of the world, their members would get into some kind of trouble because of the work they were doing resisting fascism. And then they would be scrambling to get the resources together to, get themselves out of that problem. And when you're a small local group, it can be really hard to fundraise and get the resources together. So we thought it would be a really smart idea to have a standing emergency fund set up to support anti-fascists when they ran into trouble as a result of their anti-fascist work. A couple of us had been involved in the Anti-Racist Action Network a long time ago, and that network had a defense fund set up for their members. So we sort of modeled the International Anti-Fascist Defense Fund on that. And basically, so that's kind of how we got it started in 2015, when I think we helped maybe 8 anti-fascists that year. It's funny looking back at that now that we've probably reaching 800 anti-fascists that we've helped since then.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some highlights over the years? I mean, I know you all have done a lot, and there's a kind of a wide variety of groups and people that you've helped. I mean, whether that's people that are facing, very, long-term incarceration, or people that are basically just needing a couple bucks so they can kind of go through the motions of court cases and stuff like that. And also, there's people in some countries that are facing severe, harsh repression. I'm thinking of people in like sort of the Russian controlled areas,
Absolutely, yeah. And we've actually provided as much support as we can to people in Russia, especially around what was the case? There was a case where FSB jacked up a bunch of anti-fascists and created a fictitious terrorist group that they said they all belonged to. So we've done a lot of work around that. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to look back at like 10 years and think of some things. I mean, there's been some highlights. We've a couple years ago, I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Baker's case.
Yeah.
Yes. Dan Baker, for those who don't know, was a YPG sniper who came back to America after fighting Daesh in Rojava. And shortly after the January 6th failed insurrection in DC, he sent out an alert to anti-fascists in Florida because he was concerned that a similar thing would happen at the Florida legislature. And then, long story short, the FBI railroaded him and jacked him up and said that he was trying to organize a terrorist attack on the Florida legislature. He wound up doing some jail time on that. We helped pay for his legal defense, which unfortunately was unsuccessful. But near the end of his sentence, he was really being abused by prison administration. And we organized a writing campaign to the prison administrators, telling them to back off on Dan. And we think that resulted in his early release, because I don't think the prison administration ever encountered something like 1,000 letters coming from all over the world in support of a prisoner before. And I think they thought it wasn't worth the trouble and they let him go early. So we're happy about that. We've done a lot of work around the Alex Stokes case in upstate New York. Internationally, we did a lot of work supporting Kita, who is probably the most famous anti-fascist prisoner in Belarus. It just goes on and on. We've done stuff with Joe Lamont Jenkins and One People's Project. We've done a lot of stuff supporting anti-fascists in the UK and Greece and Germany. Jock Pal Freeman from Australia, who's in jail in Bulgaria. We did a lot of work around him. So it's been quite extensive. I mean, when you look back, we're talking nearly 800 people from 26 different countries.
Wow, that's incredible. 1,000 letters for Dan Baker. I was not aware of that.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah. I actually wanted to, since you brought him up, let's talk about Alex's case, because that is just
heinous
20 years for, especially just the slap in the face of watching Trump pardon these people, which, again, I'm not cheerleading the
prison system,
system, but it just again shows like how much it can be weaponized by the state. But again, for him to get 20 years for standing up in defense of somebody against these far right people,
outrageous.
And from what I understand, for him to get essentially one of the longest sentences connected to January 6th is also, again, just a statement to just how much this can be weaponized against people, depending on, judges and cases and everything. But talk a little bit about where Alex is at right now.
So we haven't had a lot of contact with Alex or his lawyer recently, but so I want to start off by first saying Alex is salt of the earth, excellent person. Like he's the kind of guy. If you're lucky and you'll live in a city with someone like him who's around sort of the activist left scene and is just willing to put in the work and do the right thing all the time and can be relied on and counted on. He's a great, great person, a great human being, and all his friends and all his supporters will attest to that. So naturally, after the January 6th failed insurrection, when I call them the piss boys, but you know who I'm talking about there, decide to cause trouble in Albany, New York, where Alex is from, he went to the event to make sure people were safe. And when the piss boys started attacking people with clubs and tasers, Dan went into action and stopped them from beating someone to death. Unfortunately, fortunately, as the case may be, 2 piss boys got stabbed. Dan got jacked up on those charges. We helped pay for his legal defense, which was unfortunately unsuccessful, and he got slammed with a 20-year prison sentence, which is really surprising given that no one actually suffered permanent injury or died. And he was acting entirely in self-defense. If you watch, there's a great video on YouTube that shows like a frame-by-frame takedown of what happened. It was clear that he was coming to the defense of people who were being assaulted by armed fascists. So Dan's had an appeal a few weeks, maybe a few months ago, of his sentence. Unfortunately, that was unsuccessful. Now we're mounting a second appeal, which I think is called a judicial review, and we're covering the costs of that as well. We hope that it's successful. And I don't know if Alex can hear this, but Alex, if you do get to hear this, keep your head up. You're not forgotten.
So, just in the case of Alex, like let's talk about a little bit about this, because I know there's been one appeal that's been unsuccessful. Like him being in New York, isn't there a way to pressure folks there and to point out just how bullshit this is, that someone is being targeted with this amount of time?
I mean, I feel like we're screaming into the wind here. Like I'm not a legal authority, especially in the state of New York. And I think we've really made a strong case demonstrating what bullshit this is. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who we tell. We have to make 3 judges agree in the appeal process. And so far, we've been unsuccessful with that.
Gotcha. Well, definitely, it's great that people like you are working on this, and hopefully, people can continue to support Alex, and he'll be out soon.
For sure.
What other cases are going on right now that you all are working on?
I mean, there's not a lot that I can really talk about publicly right now. So how the Defense Fund works is when we find out about a situation or an anti-fascist contacts us for help, we have a little crew of about 1,600 anti-fascists who've been invited to participate in the decision-making processes of how the Defense Fund is used. Basically, anyone who donates at least $20 to the Defense Fund gets an invite to belong to this crew. So right now we have 2 cases. I don't want to get into too much because I don't have permission from the people who made the request. One is in the U.S., one is in Finland, actually. And the decisions crew is discussing those cases. And if we can't come to consensus after a week's worth of discussion, we're just going to go to a majority vote and decide what to do with those 2.
Yeah, I mean, I encourage people, I think projects like this, I know the Anarchist Black Cross also has a similar sort of program. They have the ABC War Chest, but, they get donations that come in and they send that out to folks that are incarcerated. So they get money for commissary, stamps, writing materials, books, all that stuff. But, this is, if you're looking for a project to donate to every month or year or just, a one-off, this is definitely something I would encourage you to support because it will have a real impact.
Much appreciated. Thanks so much.
I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about why people should donate and where it'll go to or.
Well, happy to do that. So our defense fund is set up and our mission is to help people who run into an emergency situation or run into trouble as a direct result of their work as anti-fascists. So that very often means legal defense and legal aid support. We've had a very good success rate with that. Aside from the cases we talked about previously, we've had many cases where anti-fascists have beat charges simply because they're able to hire a competent lawyer. So that's a big thing. But we've also helped with medical bills. We've helped do emergency relocations of anti-fascists who are being threatened in their homes. We've helped replace property and repair damages. So it really runs the gamut for the Defense Fund. And then we have a second project that sort of emerged from the Defense Fund. It's around July 25th, which is the International Day of Solidarity with Anti-Fascist Prisoners. Because once you're in prison, it's not really an emergency situation anymore, but people still want to support anti-fascist prisoners, which of course, we're down with. So we started a separate fund to support anti-fascist prisoners. And every July 25th, we take the money that we've raised throughout that year and we divide them up amongst the anti-fascist prisoners we're aware of that we have contact information for or for their supporters or families.
Yeah, what do you see the work looking like, right now? I mean, yeah.
You know what's weird is I really thought with the state of things I really thought 2025 would blow up and we'd see a lot more emergency requests from people. But so far, not so much. I think people are kind of a little trepidatious, a little worried about what's happening and are sort of keeping their powder dry and figure out how best to react to the events as they unfold. But I imagine that's going to pick up pretty quickly in the coming months, especially around the summertime. Summer's always very hot. People are out on the streets and doing stuff. And then, but on the other hand, with the prisoner support list, I think we're already seeing that's growing and growing and growing. Not just in the U.S., but around the world as well. So I think right now we have something like 40 anti-fascist prisoners on our list. So, yeah.
I wanted to turn now and talk a little bit about, we brought up Russia and that whole experience. I mean, that's been in the news. Talk a little bit about some of the international cases in that work as well, because I think those are really important to highlight.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to talk? Well, so there's an interesting case right now that we're investigating right now around Young Guard, which is a socialist anti-fascist network in France. Right now, the French government has a law that allows them to force groups to, quote, it's literally dissolve is how they call it. So they can force groups to shut down if they deem that those groups are too extreme or too radical. So we're looking to hopefully provide legal support with Young Guard on that. About a year or two ago, a similar thing happened to another group in Bordeaux, France, where they tried to dissolve them, Offensive Anti-Fascist Bordeaux. And we were able to help them successfully fight that action. So there's that. Russia, of course, is a disaster. Belarus is still really bad. There's still a lot of anti-fascists locked up in Belarus. Yeah, so a lot's going on all over the world right now. Unfortunately, we don't have really good contacts in Latin and South America or some Asian countries, and we're hoping to really expand our capacity to reach out to people there and get a better handle of what's going on. But in terms of sort of Europe and North America, it's popping off all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the thing you mentioned about the Russian state manufacturing like a terrorist group, we've seen this, not to the same degree, of course, but in 2020, DHS agents were interviewing people trying to find the leader of capital A, capital N, capital, Antifa.
Right.
So I think that that's something that I'm interested in your take on. Like, are we seeing that in other countries as well? Sort of the weaponization of terrorism charges, and sort of like in the U.S., we've seen like a push towards like manufacturing Antifa into this boogeyman that is this big organization that has a top-down leadership structure, as opposed to a political stance that people take in opposition to the far right.
Yeah, well, a great example of that would be what's happening in Europe right now around Hungary and also Germany and France and elsewhere. What happened there in Hungary, every year there's a march of a fascist march through Budapest, and neo-Nazis from all over Europe come to participate in that. About 2 years ago, a network of anti-fascists worked together to shut down that event and, really make the Nazis regret showing up there. They were successful, but there has been an international collaboration between law enforcement agencies throughout the EU to arrest these people, deport them to Hungary, and imprison them there. So there's been a lot going around about that. It's hard to keep track of what's going on. I think right now, one woman is in prison in Hungary. Another person was just released from Hungary back to Germany, but his trial is not complete in Hungary, and he's going to have to go back to that potentially. So there's been a lot going on with those things. I think 18 anti-fascists from 4 or 5 different countries have been hunted down basically by law enforcement in Europe over this.
What do you think some of the lessons are from these other countries for us here?
I think the big lesson is we have to stick together, and we have to show solidarity with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of heart to go out in the street and confront fascists. It takes a lot of heart to stand up for what's right. And when people do that, we need to show that solidarity isn't just a slogan or an empty, meaningless word on the left that we throw around to make ourselves feel better. And one of the best ways to do that is to support other anti-fascists when they are in trouble, whether that means giving them a place to stay, or whether that means kicking in to make sure that they can hire competent lawyers, or whether that means just writing them a letter when they're in prison, which is like gold if you're in prison. I'm sure a lot of people who have been in prison can attest to that. There's always something you can do to support other anti-fascists who are in trouble, and doing that is probably as important as confronting fascism itself.
Yeah, the other thing I want to point out is that every year there's a day of solidarity with anti-fascist prisoners. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So we've my crew, Antifa International, has sort of taken over coordinating that as much as we can. We've got a website up called Support Antifa Prisoners on WordPress. We keep a current list of anti-fascist prisoners that we're aware of there. If anyone knows of any that's missing on that list, please get in touch with us and we'll update that. We have a fund set up to send support money to anti-fascist prisoners every July 25th with that. And we just encourage people on July 25th to do something to mark the day, to let people locked up because they were fighting fascism know that they're not forgotten and you remember them. Whether that's holding a letter writing event or dropping a banner or holding a concert or some sort of show, or kicking some funds into to our support fund. There's something you can do to support anti-fascist prisoners, and it's important to do that.
Anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I hope everyone's staying safe out there, and I really want to thank you, and It's Going Down, for all the stuff you guys have done over the years. You've been instrumental to us for finding out about cases and things that we need to support. So please keep doing what you're doing.
Awesome. Yeah, I also want to encourage you all have a store as well, right? That has some pretty awesome swag. If people want to check that out.
Oh, yeah. So, because it turns out George Soros does not fund Antifa, much to my disappointment, we have to sell T-shirts and stuff. So if you look for us online, you'll find a whole bunch of shirts that we put out. And the proceeds either go directly to the Anti-Fascist Defense Fund, or they'll go to a specific anti-fascist crew that the shirts were designed by.
Well, yeah, stay tuned, and encourage people to check out our show notes for ways to follow the group. And yeah, lots of stuff coming up, and really encourage people, if you can, kick a few bucks their way. And this is a project to follow and support because it's very well needed, and as you point out, doing some amazing work.
Thanks so much.
Learn the facts about political prisoners, because the world they defend, that world is also yours when crime is defined by those who want power. Your attitude can cost your freedom at any hour. To be an anarchist prisoner means longer sentence time, more intense security, communications more deprived. Not because the crime was greater, not because of a violent nature. Consequence much more severe because it stands for one virus.
Okay, we are here recording. We're a couple days into ongoing demonstrations in Los Angeles. As we record, this is on a Wednesday, June 11th. So take that what it is, International Day of Solidarity with long-term anarchist prisoners. And the National Guard is in Los Angeles, and along with a group of Marines. We're going to be talking about sort of what this means, unpacking a lot of that, sort of trying to divorce it from fever dreams of whatever, also talking about the response to the ongoing demonstrations in Los Angeles across the political spectrum. But I guess to get started, I feel like there's two kind of reactions people have. One is this is the fascist Trumpian state ripping whatever mask it had left on off. This is it. It has arrived. I think the other thing people are saying is this is a logistical question. They really don't have that much, juice in this situation, I guess. They send in National Guard troops who are sleeping on the floor. The Marines don't have actual bullets. They're staging outside the city. I think there's some truth in both of those kind of positions. But, in the big picture, how do we look at this? What's happening?
Yeah, so, we were talking about this before we started recording, but I think there's two perspectives we have to always keep in mind when we're looking at this situation, from both the perspective of reading government response, but also the perspective of reading our response. The first is the actual material reality of what is happening. So what started all of this was an immigration raid, and that immigration raid sort of escalated into a neighborhood conflict, and ICE got trapped in this neighborhood and ended up fighting their way out. And in the process of fighting their way out, they set off this massive kind of street riot situation. And in response, Trump called in the National Guard. Now, first, right? So initially calls in the National Guard. Now, what's important about that is the National Guard is technically under command of a governor, right? So technically Gavin Newsom controls the California National Guard. It is possible to federalize the National Guard in certain contexts, right? So one of those contexts is that you declare state of insurrection, right? Which is what this is being confused for. That's not what they did. And I want to make that really clear. They never declared a state of insurrection under the Insurrection Act. What they did was they instead found a different authority. under Title 10 of the U.S. Federal Code. It allows the commander-in-chief to, in certain circumstances, command the National Guard to protect federal facilities, essentially, right? That is what they're using. Now, the last time the National Guard was called in against the wishes of a governor was, I think, 1965 in Alabama, when they were desegregating schools, right? And Lyndon Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard and forced them to desegregate the schools, right? That was the last time this happened. In 1992, the California National Guard was federalized during the LA riots, but that was done with the consent of the governor, right? And that was done to place the California National Guard under the U.S. military chain of command, right? It was a formality that they had to sort of go through, right? This is more like what Johnson did. This is more on the level of the commander-in-chief declaring that a state no longer has sovereignty over its own, essentially, militia, right? And that's what the National Guard is meant to functionally be, is the quote-unquote militia. So that's significant, right? And I want to make that really clear. That is significant. It is not Trump declaring a state of insurrection. I think it's important that he didn't do that. Part of it is to declare a state of insurrection, you have to declare that you do not have control over an area and that you have to retake the area for the federal government. And that is definitely something which would indicate weakness on their part. So they very specifically didn't declare that. They also very specifically didn't suspend posse comitatus. Instead, what they're doing is they're kind of doing this thing that they always do, which is they find some loose legal justification for a thing they want to do. They do the thing, then they force the courts to come by and say, well, that justification doesn't work, and then they go find another one, right? But what they're not doing is they're not going, the country is in a state of insurrection, because that would also be a full suspension of the rule of law, right? And so they haven't declared that kind of state of emergency situation yet, very specifically, likely for political reasons, right? They don't want to be seen as having lost. That's the formal reality, right? And there's about 2,000 National Guard on the street in LA. Most of them are sleeping at the federal building. They don't have any orders. They don't really have any gear. They don't really have a lot to do. They've deployed about 300 of them out onto the street. There's apparently 2,000 more coming. But again, there's not logistics for them, right? Then Trump also deployed a unit of the Marine Corps from 29 Pines, which is around the corner from Los Angeles. It's a Marine base. It's really close. And essentially deployed them out to a federal facility at which they're just sitting. And part of the reason is that military operations require a lot of logistics. Like feeding and housing 4,000 people on a moment's notice is not easy to do. Any of us that have ever done mass mobilization organizing or disaster response or anything can absolutely confirm this. Like feeding and housing and helping to like manage the needs of thousands and thousands and thousands of people is really hard. And so you can't just like throw that down on the ground and just do it. But that's exactly what they did. So they showed up. Traditionally in military planning, you decide on a mission. You have a group of lawyers sit around and decide on rules of engagement. From those two conversations, you then build an operational plan. Then you go logistically gather all the equipment you need and start shipping it to the location. Then later you send troops, right? Then you're sending engineering squads out first to like build housing and cooking facilities and stuff like that. Then you're sending soldiers, right? They did the whole thing backwards. They sent soldiers first, then decided on a mission, then decided on rules of engagement, which the Department of Defense just published this morning after troops are already on the ground, and then figured out the logistics. And so right now, of those 4,000 California National Guard that are either in Los Angeles or on the way, most of them don't have beds. Most of them don't have equipment. Most of them don't have adequate food, right? So like this isn't a force capable of fighting in any kind of real way right now. Right? In a week or two, that's a different story. But right now, they don't have the capability to really be doing the things that Trump is saying that they're doing. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, at the same time, they're also, working along with the LAPD and exacting extreme violence on the people of Los Angeles, right? And that's also important to keep in mind. But it is definitely not a like full-blown soldiers on the streets military occupation. And then there's the second part of this, which is the kind of spectacularization. right? Trump is engaging in this. He said, even before the National Guard got there, we quelled the riots. The National Guard quelled the riots the 2 hours before any Guard troops were even in Los Angeles, right? He's been talking this big game on social media about crushing the insurrectionists and, destroying the leftists and like all of this stuff. And he has portrayed this as we are taking control of the situation kind of moment. I think, on the other hand, a lot of people in our circles have also not necessarily been looking at the situation in the most sober way. And there's a lot of spectacularization going on in radical circles as well. There's a lot of rumors. I've spent a good amount of time yesterday trying to explain to people how, like, ATF and DEA agents, when they get deployed in a situation like that, don't have uniforms. So if you see people without uniforms, that doesn't mean they're military contractors, and that doesn't mean that they're undercovers. It just means that they're deputized federal agents, right? And that we've seen that in a number of situations. And so when we spectacularize these things, we create the reality in a way that Trump is trying to create. That a lot of this is about fear. A lot of this is about creating a new normal in which when protests break out, the National Guard just shows up and gets deployed, and then everybody just goes home, right? That's a situation that they're trying to construct. And when we don't look at the situation in a sober light, when we look at the situation through spectacularization and anxiety and stress, and we're not looking at things like they don't have food, right? They don't have a mission. They're not even on the streets, right? Like, when we start to look at things like that, we start to see a very different reality, which is a reality that is much more like what Trump did with the dams in California during the LA fires, right? That what happened in that situation, for those of you that don't remember, is there were dams in Northern California that were holding water for reservoirs for cities up in the northern part of the state. And Los Angeles had, quote, run out of water, which isn't actually what happened. It's just that they were trying to put out so many fires that the water pressure dropped, but they, quote, ran out of water. So Trump deploys the, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers out to this dam to open up the valves of the dam. And then he says, we solved the problem. We put the fires out, blah, blah, blah. The reality is that the water system in Northern California and the water system in Southern California, unless you take very specific steps to connect them together, are different. And so releasing that water in Northern California literally did nothing. But it showed that he did something. And a lot of Trumpism is about this idea that we are in this crisis, that we have to do something, and that something has to happen without any sort of these like limitations of democratic values or, limitations on government power or things like that we have to do something now. And a lot of this is about portraying that idea that they're doing something, when in reality, they're not really. The state of California didn't ask for the National Guard to show up. The LAPD was pretty clearly telling people that they, had the situation contained, like they weren't looking for backup. And so there's a spectacularization element to this that we have to be incredibly careful about perpetuating. Right. Another example of this that I point to always is the Edward Snowden leaks. Right. Edward Snowden dropped gigs of documents out there, and a lot of them were very technical and not something that a lot of people without technical background could really understand what was going on. And so what happened is we fell into this pattern of listening to people that were spectacularizing what was going on. And they were talking about how the NSA listens to all of our calls and they read all of our emails and blah, 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 blah. And most of that was based on very faulty technical analysis. But that mentality took over. And for a lot of people that I know, they dropped out of organizing for a year or two afterwards, just trying to figure out how to be safe. When the reality is that we were worried about them listening to our phone calls. But what we weren't talking about was how few of those they can actually listen to at one time. How hard it is to bank up all that data and then search it. How few analysts they have. Like, we weren't looking at the logistical parts of how the NSA works, which was the other part of those leaks. Instead, people spectacularized what they were capable of. Right? And so we have to be really, really, really careful in situations like this to be able to say, yes, the National Guard is there. What does that mean? Not the National Guard is there, oh my God, it's military occupation. But the National Guard is there. Logistically, practically, materially, on the ground, what does that mean?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that legally they're only able to guard the federal building, right?
Technically, federal facilities, plural. Now, we learned in 2020 that the definition of what counts as federal is really loose. And we learned that, if you set a parking shed on fire in Cleveland, Ohio, in a parking lot that belongs to the police department, well, $100 to build that parking shed came from the federal government. So that makes it a federal crime now. Right? Like they very creatively interpret what federal property means. And so we have to also keep that in mind. Now, the reality is that they haven't really left the courthouse area. They've been active in the streets around it, but they haven't really left the immediate courthouse area, sort of like how they operated in Portland in 2020, where they sort of, garrisoned in a location and then defended the location. That's a lot of what's going on right now.
Which, again, I think the Portland comparison is one that we should think on, because in many ways it's a sort of larger scale version of that. And if you remember in 2020, the protests in many ways were winding down in Portland. Because remember, Portland sort of continued on while the rest of the country, there was obviously still stuff happening, but the intensity sort of had died down. And then what happened was that somebody was swept off the streets during one of the demonstrations, put in an unmarked van and arrested. And it was like, what happened to this person? And it was because of the outrage of that happening. Also, somebody was shot in the head with like a projectile weapon by one of the, I think it was one of the federal forces.
Yeah.
This led to night after night after night of demonstrations. This got to the point where even the mayor of Portland came out, which was seen as sort of this watershed moment, like, oh, even the mayor is here. And then we had like the mom block come out. We had dad block, veteran block, all these different blocks of people sort of get involved in the demonstrations. And, by the end, literally George Floyd's family, when Darren Wilson was indicted and sent to prison, said, we want to thank the people of Portland for protesting nonstop. Yeah. This is what made it possible. So, and again, like, you look at the exit polls for support for the BLM protests, investigations into the demonstrations, like basically leading to the defeat of Trump in that election cycle. It's funny, again, that people are wringing their hands over these protests in LA so much, when in reality, like, this should be something that the left should be celebrating and supporting and getting behind across the board. One thing I do want to return to, so we've seen tweets from DHS saying that they are helping with immigration enforcement in the city. So we've seen like photos of heavily armed National Guard with like rifles and stuff while they're arresting people. So I kind of want to return to your point about like, they don't have the logistical capabilities yet. So what happens in a week? Does that mean that they are going to then occupy Los Angeles? Because again, like, we've seen photos of, there's like a little red circle where it's like, this is where the protests are, and then you zoom out, and then like, LA is massive. It's a massive. Huge. Like, they would need hundreds of thousands of troops if they wanted to.
So to use the normal military calculus that is used in sort of counterinsurgency, like low intensity counterinsurgency situations, they assume 1 troop for every 100 population. And they assume, I think it's like 5 troops for every insurgent. And so Los Angeles has 10 million people in it. That's 1 million soldiers. That's 1/3 of the entire standing U.S. Army. So this is another thing, getting to spectacularization, right? Before we were recording, we were talking about the state I live in during 2020 and what happened. And in that state, there were 5 or 6 cities that really went up during the uprising, and the National Guard deployed to all of them. Now, the city I'm in went up harder than all the others. And so on day one, what we saw a small garrison of National Guard troops show up and start to control the downtown area, which is where a lot of the initial rioting happened, right? But there weren't enough to control the city, because what they had to do is they had to put down uprisings in other cities to free up enough troops to bring them to the place I live, right? That's one state and one National Guard, and that's the state's National Guard. They don't have that ability. If we're talking about U.S. military operations, monetarily, logistically, on a pure material level, It takes a lot to move 1 million troops somewhere, and that's one city. And so I want to be really clear. I've written about this extensively in my own writings, but if we look at the way that policing works, it doesn't actually work by having adequate force to suppress everything directly, right? That there's not cops standing in every single corner store looking for shoplifters. That what happens is there's cameras in those corner stores. And we assume that the footage is both being recorded and would be given to police if somebody stole something. And so we control ourselves, right? We become our own deterrents and don't do the thing, right? But when that breaks down, when the ability of police to respond to an area breaks down because there's too much resistance to their movements, which is what happened with ICE in LA, when the ability to move forces around an area gets disrupted because you can't move through space, when conflict is constantly shifting and changing character, all of a sudden you become very incapable of responding to much of anything. So 3.2 million US military personnel are not going to have the ability to control the country. Just to put that out there on like a purely logistical, totally sober, cold mathematical level. There is no way that they can occupy all of our cities at once. That is not a possible reality. What they're trying to convince us of is that it is. They are trying to convince us that if we decide to fight, then this will be all of our realities. But the pure mathematics of it is that that's not possible. And so what we're looking at, what Los Angeles is really sort of foreshadowing, I think. Robert Evans talks about this idea that this summer we're going to see mass uprisings like in 2020. And I think that there is some truth to that, likely. But I think that there's going to be something fundamentally different. Right. So in 2020, in a lot of places, like including where I live, that fight was very direct, right? Like we were fighting the local police department over their practices, trying to get them off of our streets, right? But in a lot of places, it was a little bit more abstract. It was like they were protesting against police violence and things like this. Like it was a symbolic protest, right? What we're watching right now is we're watching a situation in which that space for symbolic protest, in which we lodge a complaint and somebody listens to it and changes policy, that's not a world that exists at the moment. That they are in power based on the notion that they are going to crush us. So when people like Bernie Sanders go out there and say, oh, everyone needs to peacefully protest, what that indicates to me is that Bernie Sanders does not understand literally anything about this situation right now. That the reality is that whether they declare a state of insurrection or not, what we're doing is we're slowly creeping into a state of emergency situation. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to find the legal grounding for that. But we're drifting that direction. But that doesn't mean that that becomes our reality. And so we're dealing with this kind of collision between, and this is common in the era of Trump. We're dealing with a collision between the material realities on the ground and the threats and spectacularization that occur. That the threats and the spectacularization and radical movements are not complicit in this, has been to freak everybody out that the National Guard is going to show up in your town and occupy your city. But the material reality of that is that is not possible. And so what this ends up looking like is this ends up looking like a state which is overstretched. We've already seen this. We've already seen this administration claim to be doing things on really large scales, when in reality, they have like 4 people working on a thing using ChatGPT to write something and, barely scratching the surface of something which is like deep and complex. And we're watching the same thing happen here. That they're kind of poo-pooing military occupation. They're like, yeah, we could just do this. And look at Los Angeles. But the reality is that that's not going to look the same everywhere. That's going to look very different in different places, depending on local political dynamics, state political dynamics, what's going on in the country, how many other places are going up at the same time. Like all of this is going to look radically different where we are. And so, unlike 2020, it seems like a lot of these struggles are going to be a lot like what's going on in LA right now, which is a fight that started over something that happened very immediately in a physical place in an actual neighborhood. And the difference here, and this is a really important difference, when struggle becomes incredibly material like that, what we're watching in Los Angeles is an entire community of people rising up against the federal government right now. Not activists, not people who like know each other because they share the same political identity or something like that. Like, these are people who live their lives together. They rely on one another. They work for each other. They're friends and family, right? That level of connection is much more powerful in a struggle situation than anything that we could ever put together through like random networks of people.
You know, that's what makes, and we can talk more about this later, but I think that's what makes statements from whether like people like Nancy Pelosi or Gavin Newsom or, you know, idiots on the right, you know, even more stupid, saying that like anarchists or whoever, or, you know, criminals, you know, foreign invaders flying different flags or whatever, are somehow like tricking everyone else into doing this, or like the reason behind the violence, quote unquote, you know, even more silly. Like, it's very clear what's happening. Yeah. Like you said, communities of people are responding to this. I mean, literally, like you said, like the second day of the protest, which, as you mentioned, took place in Paramount, which is, you know, in Los Angeles, outside of a Home Depot, and they basically rolled up to arrest people in this area, and the community responded, and they basically got boxed in, and the LAPD was there but basically refused to do backup for them, and they got surrounded by the community, and then they had to leave while people were pelting them with rocks. And that's what, like you said, that's what kind of triggered them to call in the National Guard, which I think that leads us to our next question, is like, will the National Guard be used essentially as protection to carry out raids? Because that in itself is very scary. I mean, it's one thing if like they're going to like cosplay as like, you know, occupy an entire city, which you said isn't really feasible. Although I think like definitely, as we saw in 2020, you know, just having them there like is a real deterrent against protests.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, let's be real. But I think the idea that like they're going to march in with DHS officers, like, you know, into, you know, a slaughterhouse and just arrest hundreds of people that don't have papers is terrifying.
Yeah, it is. It is. And there's not really a legal justification to use the National Guard that way. But that doesn't mean they won't try. And so I think we're going to see a test of this in Texas very soon. The governor of Texas just mobilized the Texas National Guard voluntarily to protect federal facilities and to help with immigration raids. Now, there's a couple of elements of this that I think are really important to point out, though. First is, when you need to roll 50 to 100 people out to an immigration raid, that's logistically very heavy and really hard to hide. And so you're making the response of people in the area a lot more likely. Because now you're not rolling in with one unmarked car. Now it's a convoy. And that convoy has military vehicles in it. Right? That all of a sudden starts to look a lot like the occupation that people are worried about. And if you look at the polling that's come out in the last few days, the vast majority of Americans, over 70%, are fundamentally against the idea of deploying the U.S. Army in a context like this. And so they can deploy the National Guard, but the National Guard's going to have limits. They can try and deploy the Army, but the Army is not allowed to be used for law enforcement purposes. And so they get stuck in this legal contradiction where they have to either admit that crossing the border without papers isn't actually a crime, it's just a violation, and that therefore the National Guard can't be used at all because what you're trying to do is enforce a violation, right? So they can say this is a violation and not a crime, and they can bring in the National Guard and use them, or they can say this is a crime and then not use the National Guard. What they can't say is this is a crime, we're using the National Guard. There's no basis for that in American law, right? And so I think we're going to watch a lot. I mean, the court challenge is already happening. And one of the things that this administration has done a lot of is they've sort of taken an action, tried to defend it in court, lost, found another justification, tried to defend it in court, lost, and they just keep doing this. Like, they find another argument, they just keep it rolling, right? But every single time that they lose, it imposes more restrictions. And so what this ultimately ends up looking like, I don't know. because on a legal level, we've never seen this before. This is not something that there's really precedent in American legal code to really figure out what to do. So I think that the basic reality here is that we probably are going to see them used in some places, right? We'll probably see them used in places where it's going to be easy to get a good clip for Fox News, where Kristi Noem can show up in costume and like go on an immigration raid with the National Guard. You know, like they'll do something like that. But that doesn't mean that we're going to see that everywhere. And this is, again, I've pointed this out a number of times in this episode, past episodes, things I've been writing. It is deeply important for us to be fundamentally grounded when we are fighting in the space that we're in, right? What is happening where we're at? What does this mean where we are, right? It can even be a situation where in Texas, the governor calls in the National Guard to help with immigration enforcement and then just does that in like 4 or 5 cities. I think what we have to remember, the United States is really big. There's a lot of people in it. And it's a really hard to control space. And so you're not going to see the kind of like Syrian government style wipe out the cities, big military occupation. That's not logistically possible. But what we might see is these kind of spectacularization type raids where they bring 50 National Guard in with some ICE agents to go do a thing in Texas. But again, I want us to be very careful to not fall into the spectacularization of that. That we need to recognize that that is, if that happens, an incident that will get challenged in court, that isn't going to happen just like that the next time, and that isn't going to happen like that everywhere. And so what we need to look at is what is ICE doing in our areas, right? Like I really like in Los Angeles, the way that people have organized against ICE is really amazing with massive public intelligence networks and rapid response and all of these things. There's a popular assembly in Detroit that is getting something together like this. In the city I live in, there's a discussion of getting a popular assembly together to respond to this, right? And what's happening in those contexts is that there is not just an attempt to like get people together in a room to talk about protests, because that's not meaningful. Instead, what's happening in those contexts is people are getting together to figure out how to defend themselves, what logistics they need, how to build them together, and how to make decisions collectively. Right, that it is the foundation of the mechanism that lets us fight locally, right? And so really starting to move into organizing where we're at, not just amongst the people that we know, but organizing where we're at, figuring out ways to get information, figuring out ways to track what federal agents are doing in our area, and figuring out ways to respond effectively, right? We're not going to win every confrontation. We're not even going to win most of them. But the reality is that every single time we engage in it, we make them have to bring more people next time. We make them have to be more visible next time. We make them have to be more confrontational next time, right? We create a situation that's harder for them to operate in. And that means that they operate less. They might operate in more concentration, but they're not going to be doing it as often. And so we need to figure out how they operate so we can figure out how to drive them out. And one of the things that's going on in Los Angeles that's really fascinating to me, why I emphasize that this struggle started with a confrontation in a community of people, is that what's happening now is that community of people is engaging in area denial. They're forcing ICE out and they're not letting them back in. And that is not a protest, right? That is a direct act of resistance. That's what our future is going to look like in the US. That's what we're going to have to understand. Not just ISIS in our city. What are they doing? Who are they doing it with? Who are they bringing along? What are they targeting? Right? So one of the things I notice in the city I live in is they don't come into the city very much. But out in the farms outside the city, they raid things all the time, but they do it at certain times when they know no one's watching and they can grab a bunch of workers really quick. Like, they're taking these things into account. And that is disrupting their operations. And so what we need to be focusing on is how we do that materially, logistically, right? Like, I know a lot of people want to go rah-rah on the streets about this now, and by all means, please don't go to PSL demonstrations, but by all means, please. But that's not what's going to stop any of this. What's going to stop this from happening the next time is us being able to defend ourselves as a community of people where we live. Not protests, not signs, not asking, not demanding, but just doing.
I want to read this thread from Mike Rothschilds, who's a journalist, talks about conspiracy theories and the far right. I just think this is pretty interesting. He says the best outcome for the U.S. right now is if the protests continue to expand and become too big to contain. Trump spends a few more days pretending to be a tough guy and then gets bored, spends the next week picking a fight with Turner Classic Movies over their schedule or something. Trump has shown again and again that he loves to talk a big game and make grandiose threats, but when the hammer falls, he doesn't have the juice or the attention span to go full dictator. He wants to be adored more than he wants to consolidate power. He's loving the attention and the chance to play mini Mussolini, but putting a city of 4 million under martial law, that's too much work and takes too long. He ultimately just doesn't care that much. But that's what's most likely to save us. He's just too lazy to put in the work to be a real dictator. I don't know. Does that square with your analysis?
Yeah. I think so. I think the other element of this, though, and maybe the part that's missing, is he doesn't have the support to be a dictator. He doesn't have the military force. He doesn't have the ability to crush a population. He doesn't have overwhelming support. There's not some big national crisis he can leverage. Right? We have to keep in mind, and again, I've said this on this show a number of times, but it bears repeating. Dictatorship takes a long time. It doesn't just happen overnight. Right? If you look at the rise of Erdogan in Turkey, that took 10 years. Right? Putin in Russia took 10 years. And these are people who are competent, surrounded by people that are competent, with a clear sense of mission, and a very large attention span, and also they're leaders of places which have a history of authoritarianism, right? Military dictatorships, party dictatorships. That's not true here. And so we're looking at really different circumstances. And even if we were looking at exactly the same ones, 10 years is a long time. And so these things don't happen overnight. I think that's one element of that thread that's really true. These things don't happen overnight. They take a lot of persistence. They take ideological commitment, right? Someone like Mussolini was deeply ideologically committed, and also built the fascist movement over the course of 10 years. Right? So these things happen slowly. They happen through processes of normalization, and they often happen through us being willing to evacuate the field of conflict out of fear. That one of the things that is deeply important that you learn if you study the history of the rise of authoritarianism is that often that happens because they're able to leverage a sort of social fragmentation. They're able to say, well, you don't have to care about us repressing these people over here. They're not the same as you. They don't have the same interests. And so the more that we can sort of refuse the spectacularization, the more that we can ground our resistance in the situations that we're in, building the logistics of autonomy where we are, and the more that we can sort of look at the situation as it is, the more that what we're going to see is we're going to see the spectacularization elements of this. That he doesn't have the logistical capacity to be a dictator. And as Mike Rothschild says, probably doesn't have the attention span. But I think that there's a bigger question, even if he did, of whether or not that would even be possible. And I would argue that it's not. The United States is huge. It is complex. It is complicated terrain that is deeply mountainous. Many people are armed, right? It's not a space that's easy to control. And the size of the U.S. military pales in comparison to that. And so, this is kind of, I say this about right-wing militias too. Militias have this fantasy that they're going to end up in some direct confrontation with the U.S. Army in some like one-to-one frontal war or something like that. But that's A, not how wars happen in the modern era, and B, not how insurgencies happen. That's a fantasy. That's not real, right? The reality is that often what's happening is you're dealing with heavily armed but vastly dispersed forces over really large areas, dealing with incredibly and increasingly restive populations. And we can see what happens when they stick 400,000 troops in Iraq. Not only do they not succeed in doing counterinsurgency, they lose. They lost in Afghanistan too. right? And those were places where they had air cover, drones, satellite surveillance, all this other stuff, full logistics, military bases, air bases, all of these things. And they couldn't control that space, right? The United States is much bigger than both of those places. Much bigger. More than 10 times the size of both of those places. And there's not 10 times the number of troops. There's definitely not 100 times the number of troops, right? So, like, we have to think about these things on a logistical, strategic level, right? We get our advantages when we fight in the places we know, with the communities that we're a part of, in the cities that we call home, right? We lose when we engage on their terrain, when we try and do this through symbolic protest, when we try and convince them, when we try and win the media game or something like that. That's when we lose, because we're engaging on terrain we have no advantages on. But when we engage like people are doing in Los Angeles right now, you can see the effect, right? Even if they drive all the protesters off the streets, ICE is going to have an incredibly hard time operating in large parts of Los Angeles for the foreseeable future. They've started a permanent conflict now. And every single time they go into that community now, from now until the foreseeable, end of time, they're going to have to fight their way out, right? That's what's different here, is that they didn't just start a fight with some protesters. They kicked off a struggle against an entire community of people. And that's not one that governments traditionally win.
Yeah, there's a beautiful report on the New Republic that's by Melissa Grant. I just want to read from. This is quoting Ron Guchez, a community organizer. I believe this is something he said on Democracy Now! He said they're talking about what happened on that day where they raided the Home Depot. Over 8 hours on Saturday, he said, this is Ron Guchez, after a battle with Border Patrol. And it was a battle, he said, because there were people throwing back tear gas, people throwing everything they could to defend themselves and to defend the workers that were being surrounded. The Border Patrol retreated. And the hundreds of workers that were in the factories around them were able to escape. Guchez recounted, they were able to get in their cars and go home, and that was only thanks to the resistance that allowed them to go home that night. If any community was going to fight back without apology, it was this one. Just amazing stuff.
Absolutely.
There's another editorial on PRISM from Tina Vasquez, and she writes, and like many audacious, power-hungry leaders before him, Trump has vastly underestimated his adversaries. So I just want to step back. We've been talking about logistics a little bit. I do want to mention you brought up like polling. There's been a couple interesting polls where it's like, 35 in support of this, 50% opposed. In a couple days, will this be again like another Trump fiasco where they're just sort of trying to explain it through conspiracy theories or whatever? It seems to be a little different than that. I mean, this isn't Signalgate. This isn't Elon breaking up with Trump. I mean, this is real flesh and blood, bad shit. So how do you think this will play out in the court of public opinion? I mean, also you've got Gavin Newsom filing a lawsuit against this. So far, it seems like the courts have put it off for a bit. What happens with all these other pressures?
Out myself a little bit. I do hang out on survivalist forums sometimes, right? As someone who doesn't not identify as a survivalist. But one of the things that's been really interesting in that world over the last few days has been a bit of a narrative shift. The right wing in the US for decades put itself forward as the people that were going to fight government tyranny, blah, 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 blah. But they also hate immigrants. And so when government tyranny is used to kick out immigrants, they're kind of stuck in this paradox, right? Which is a paradox inherent in their politics. A lot of right-wing libertarians in the United States are really well, I think people should be free, but all of society should look like this, right? Which is just incoherent politics, right? And so the incoherence of the right-wing militia movement's politics have started to come into contrast. And you're starting to see people be like, hey, wait a minute. Isn't this the thing that we just told a bunch of people that they should be worried about? Didn't we just watch 1,000 Alex Jones videos about this exact thing? Why aren't we doing anything about this, right? And then you've got other people being like, but we're kicking out the immigrants, right? There's this problem in right-wing politics and this has existed for a really long time in the United States, where you have elements of the right wing which pay lip service to the norms of democracy, but are really fascists, right? And this, there's been this tendency in the US as long as the country has existed, but especially since the 1930s, there has been a concerted effort to sort of do fascist things, but do it under the language of democracy, right? At the same time, the right wing is always complaining about government overreach. They complain about states' rights and, personal liberty and blah, 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 blah. But the problem is that those two politics are mutually exclusionary. They're not able to be reconciled with one another. But they both form the core of right-wing politics in America today. Both of them. Right? That you have people like Ron Paul and the religious right in the same political coalition. And that makes no sense. That hasn't made any sense for a really long time. And for decades, they've been able to sort of move past that. They've been able to kind of focus on counterterrorism and immigration and all of these other things. And they've been able to kind of move past that contradiction. But they can't do that anymore. And part of it is that Trumpism is kind of post-ideological. It's a lot of factions that all have the same central interest in authoritarian power. But there are lots of different factions with lots of different needs and priorities and things like this. And so when you build politics around the idea that what you're trying to do is build authoritarianism, but not define what for, what you end up with is you end up with this exact situation where now, not all of a sudden are you doing something that people disagree with in your coalition, but you're a tyrant in the process. And so these contradictions of right-wing politics in America are really starting to come to a head. I mean, you saw it a little bit with Musk and Stephen Miller over H-1B visas, right? You've definitely seen this in different priorities between, say, the oil and gas industry wanting government research grants, but also Doge cutting all the government research grants, right? Like there's a lot of these kinds of contradictions because at the end of the day, the project that is being undertaken here is ideologically incoherent. And so that's fine when things are going well. And that's fine when everyone thinks they're winning. But when all of a sudden he has to make choices between some priorities and other priorities, where he needs to choose whether he's going to side with the anti-immigrant coalition or whether he's going to side with the tech bros and their H-1B visas. That's the point in which those contradictions become obvious. And so they can paper over those all they want. They can have Musk release statements being like, I really said some things I didn't mean, blah, blah, blah. They can do that all they want, but it doesn't overcome the fact that the core of their politics are a series of irresolvable contradictions. And so, again, that all works when everyone's moving in the same direction. But when they're not anymore, when Latinos for Trump lady, who, having researched her a little bit, is like a right-wing religious extremist and a conspiracy theorist, this is a person who really wants authoritarian power and also really doesn't want to see her community get attacked. Those two things don't operate side by side in this moment. So either you have authoritarian power and that community gets attacked, or you don't have authoritarian power. And when this person realizes this, she quits. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. That as this administration defines itself as being some things and not other things, and having some priorities and not other priorities, you're going to see factions peel off. One of the biggest factions they have a problem with, that they're going to have a problem with over this, is the weird anti-vax, RFK Jr. Tulsi Gabbard types. Because these are people that are also generally conspiracy theorists. These are people who also largely, historically, are kind of hippies and don't really want to see jackbooted troops on the streets and stuff like that. You're going to have a really hard time keeping those people in line when all they're getting out of this is RFK Jr. being a wingnut on TV, but what they're sacrificing is all of their principles about authoritarianism. It's going to be hard to keep those people in line. And so how that plays out is going to be heavily dependent on what ends up happening. And to get to the question of the court challenges, we don't know. I mean, the initial circuit court decision was to not issue an injunction, that they let the National Guard stay, but that isn't a ruling. They just refused to grant an immediate injunction, but they've set a hearing date. And so what happens at that hearing will play out for the next year or two in the courts, and that will determine the shape of what this looks like in a year or two. And there's going to be plenty of people that are going to sit around and wait for that to see what happens. But I think that there's a basic reality here in which the coalition that they had built to get themselves into power is fragmented. It's falling apart. And it's falling apart out of a combination of incoherence and ineptitude. But it is falling apart.
Yeah, somebody mentioned we are witnessing the end of the Elon Musk presidency and the rise of the Stephen Miller presidency.
Yes. I think that's really accurate, actually. I think that's incredibly accurate.
Yeah.
And that's scary, but here's the thing. Stephen Miller is also a person who is fundamentally ideologically motivated. He's not a person who historically has a great grasp on reality. And so he's a conspiracy theorist. He's a fabulist, right? Like he's a person who really kind of plays up rhetoric and things like this. But what he is not is a careful, well-considered operative, right? He's a strategist. He knows how to get himself into power, but he doesn't know what to do with it necessarily. And the things that Stephen Miller wants to do are inflammatory and deeply unpopular. And so as that coalition defines itself, as someone like Stephen Miller rises and other people fall away, you're going to watch how those fissures start to form as a result of that. Not everyone in that coalition is down for this. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, right? So I already said earlier, like, attention span aside, Trump doesn't have the logistical capacity or support to be a dictator, especially not right now. Everything he's doing right now is eroding that further. He's losing support. He's losing logistical capacity. He's getting stuck in all of these long drawn out court fights and legal battles and things like this. They don't have the lawyers to argue in court with. So, you know, we've been saying this for a little while on the show, but again, to get back to how we started, we have to be very careful to not fall into spectacularization. We have to be very careful not to fall into believing the things he's saying are happening, right? We have to be really careful not to fall into fear of the threats and things like this, right? It's really easy to threaten someone on Twitter. It is very hard to do it. And we have to keep that in mind. And so as these threats come forward, the way we have to approach this is we have to say, okay, well, this is a government declaring war on us. The era of asking them for things is over. If they want to declare war on us, if they want to decide that we are the enemy, then any sort of concept of loyalty that traditionally grounded American protest is gone. It's over. It's finished. Right? That right now they're fighting a war against us and we are protesting. Right? Our response is not in line with what is happening. That if they're going to fight a material conflict against us on our streets, that's where our response needs to be. Right? Not in public squares with signs. And so we have to be really aware, again, of how does this look where we are? What is the material reality where we are? How many agents do they have in the city? What does their force composition look like? How close is the nearest National Guard base? Right? We all need to know this stuff. And we need to know this stuff now. Right? That we've moved into a world in which protest is no longer a form that is meaningful. And we have moved into a space in which everything now becomes a question of conflict and crushing dissent. And that's always going to be a fight that plays out on our street. Right? And so what we need to be doing is we need to be building these local coalitions. We need to be getting these assemblies together. We need to be organizing outside of our traditional environments. We need to be going to places where raids are happening. We need to be getting people organized. We need to be getting assemblies going. We need to be building responses, right? That's what's ultimately going to stop this. It's not going to be complaining about it. It's going to be doing something about it. And if Los Angeles teaches us anything, it's that we finally, clearly hit the moment in which at least we know that their intentions are clear, even if they are overblowing the reality. We understand that their intention is to try and crush us. right? And so we have to be very prepared for that reality. That is not a reality in which the First Amendment matters. That's not a reality in which the traditional limits of police force matter. That's not a reality in which our expectations of what the limitations of the National Guard doing matter. All of this stuff is up for question right now. And so if it's all up for question, we have to be very, 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 very attentive to what that actually really looks like, where we actually really are. Because that's the reality that we're trying to analyze, not the one that they say is occurring.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.